Howdy y'all, welcome to the Kentuckian. I know video posting's been kind of spotty recently, several different reasons for that, and with the holidays things tend to get that way as well. So just keep an eye on what's going on with the channel. I do want to be real, YouTube has been really hurting. The channel has basically stopped all growth. It's been rough. I'm evaluating what I'm going to do with that, so I guess stay tuned if you're interested. But, liking, commenting, sharing, all those things really does make a difference. Subscribe if you're not subscribed. But anyway, I don't want to spend too much time on that. Let's get into the material. I want to talk about political parties, and especially with the elections and that sort of thing going on. The recent elections have shown us, in general, an attempt to return to the political status quo, and have overall been pretty disappointing. They've been lackluster at best, I think. Well, what's the real issue with getting too caught up in the elections and who gets elected and what party's in power and that sort of thing? These questions certainly matter, but if our understanding of the situation, the political landscape is incorrect, then the results of the elections will lead us to incorrect conclusions and actions. Now, as we know, all elections effectively come down to Democrat or Republican. That's the only real political powers when it comes to political parties. But what does it matter? Does it matter what color gets elected in an election? And the thing is, we need to focus on that and understanding the political landscape so we can understand how to take elections. And that's kind of what I wanted to jump off from. So the first thing we have to understand, and I realize some of this may be like obvious to some people, but we really need to pin it down, and I want to apply it to us as well. We have to understand that political parties in the United States are effectively one and the same. These people in Washington and really in most state governments as well, they work together when they want to, but they've created a system, and this is especially true of Washington, but also the state governments. They've created a system of political theater that keeps them in power and allows them to gather wealth, influence, and so on. Anything that they might want, right? And we need to understand that. This is not the system that we learned about in civics class or history class or wherever else. It is not the system that's been portrayed. There's an underlying system that is more about, you want to use the term establishment. The establishment is not what it's portrayed as in the history books, in the propaganda movies, and whatever. There's a dominant party and there's an opposition party, but at the end of the day, these parties are not truly opposed to each other. The opposition party is there to bring opposition, as it seemed, as it would imply from the name, to the theater, to the show that they're putting on, in order to keep people satisfied, keep people from asking questions, whatever the case might be, to keep the people that disagree just satisfied enough that they don't do anything to actually change the status quo. At the end of the day, Democrats and Republicans are both on the same side. And there is a little bit of nuance to that, but especially when you talk about Washington, and especially when you talk about state governments, because there are systems in place where if you want to be in politics, you have to do certain things. You have to get certain college degrees. You have to go work at certain law firms. You have to talk to certain people. You have to know certain people. You have to follow a laid out path. Now, state governments are not quite as bad when it comes to that, but they're still very entrenched forms of power. Where do you think most of these people in Washington come from? They come from state governments. They come from a political system that existed in the state governments. As they work their way up, they eventually make it to Washington in the vast majority of the time. Just one example, Barack Obama was a senator from Illinois, and he was a senator from Illinois long before he became president. So we need to understand that at the end of the day, Republicans and Democrats are not truly opposed to each other. There might be a few outliers, but we need to understand that outliers in both parties are shunned, bought, or destroyed. And that's Democrat or Republican. If there's someone, even a very leftist person, that wants to actually shake up the system, they get pretty much wrecked. You think about I forget the nickname for him, but you think about Ilhan Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and some of those young people that probably were on the outside at first, and they basically got mashed into the system, and yet they're far, far leftist. We need to look at, well, let's be real, when Republicans get in power, what do? They do nothing. We're lucky if they maintain the status quo as it is and not actively make things worse. We saw that when Trump was president. Republicans don't do anything when they get the opportunity to. They talk a big talk. They put forth these crazy bills that they know will never get passed. And then when they have an opportunity to actually do something about it, when they do get in power, they don't do it. And that's something we need to look at the actions. That's something that should really, really bother us. See, Trump was dangerous because he wasn't either. He wasn't part of the establishment, and he couldn't be bought since he had his own money. And that's one of the keys there. You look at the money. That is extremely important, that he didn't need the Republican supermajority or super PAC money for campaigning or anything like that. He could do everything himself, and he wasn't interested in playing their game. And that's what fundamentally, more than anything else that he was or did, made him dangerous to them. We need to understand that. We need to understand that's fundamentally why they hate him so much. That's why when you look at Republicans who kind of sort of went along with him sometimes to avoid damaging their political careers, because they're trying to maintain that image, that show, but at the end of the day, they not only didn't support him, they oftentimes stood actively against him on a lot of major issues, because they can't afford to break up the status quo either, because they're on the chopping block as well. Trump was the first person in a very long time to genuinely shift the status quo. He was the first in a long time to be able to. And one of the fundamental reasons, again, is that money. He could pay for things himself. And that meant that he wasn't beholden to any of the establishment systems. Now, let's make no mistake. They don't care about politics in the sense of governing a country except as it benefits them. They don't care about the American people, and they don't care about doing what's right or even logical. Look at the issue with Hawaii and Ukraine when they had those wildfires in Hawaii burning down all these homes, and people couldn't even get relief money, and it was a bureaucratic nightmare, and yet then they would send millions or billions of dollars to Ukraine at the same time. They could have fixed everything there in Hawaii, but they chose not to, because it wasn't politically expedient for them to solve problems. Now, let's be real. I do want to make a brief mention. We need to remember that governments usually can't actually solve problems. And that's kind of a separate factor, but I did just want to mention that as we move forward. You understand, these people don't care. They're not there for public service. They portray it as that. They're not there to govern. They're there to gain stuff themselves. They're there to gain power, to gain money, to gain influence, whatever it is they're looking for. And it has nothing to do with what's good for us or the country or anybody else except for them and their buddies. And we need to recognize that. In fact, politicians are incentivized, and again, I'm saying politicians, that's Democrats and Republicans, are incentivized not to provide solutions. The status quo, things staying as they are, is dependent on major problems, having something to run on, and stretching the American citizen out ever so much, little by little, until they're totally dependent on the government or otherwise unwilling to take a stand to stop them. It's not about totally dominating the people immediately. The best thing you can do is get the people to give up themselves. These people are in it for number one, they're in it for themselves, and you, me, us are simply a means to an end. They show time and time again that they couldn't care less what happens to you and what happens to me, and yet we just sit back and we try to convince ourselves it's not that bad because it's uncomfortable. And that's what brings us to the third and final point, and bringing it to us. We need to understand that fundamentally, the way that this country is set up and the way the world in general has always been set up, the people of a country, especially in this country, have power to make real change. Have power to fix these problems. That doesn't mean it's easy. That doesn't mean that it's an easy fix, but we do have the power to do something about it. But we, the American people, don't have the right foundation. They don't have the right foundation. They don't have a moral foundation to anything that they do. They're only in it for themselves. They don't think about virtue or truth or righteousness or who they're beholden to the people that they're serving, and most importantly to God. They don't care about those things. But to be honest, a lot of us don't either. Most of us don't either. Not really. We don't have the right foundation. We don't have a moral foundation to stand on what's right, which means we're never going to do anything to fix these problems, despite the fact that they couldn't stop us if we wanted to. Folks may not like it, and a lot of people don't like it today because of how degraded and destroyed and rot and corrupted our culture is. But without a moral foundation, effectively, we only care about what happens to us. At the end of the day, without a moral standard, our number one focus eventually becomes us. Even though people might be included in that, it's still about us, about me. No freedom can be had. And any cause that's worth standing for, any cause that's worth having, the cause of freedom and self-determination and self-government and living the way that you want to live without worrying about a government coming in and stopping you, being able to provide for your family freely, being able to take care of yourselves and your neighbors, having a good relationship with your neighbors and the people around you, doing something valuable with your time and providing something for the people around you and for generations to come, all of that is ultimately rejected because it requires personal sacrifice. And if we don't have a moral foundation that tells us, hey, there is truth, there is right, and I'm going to do it not because it's easy, not because it's convenient, but because it's right, because it's correct, because I am morally obligated to do it, none of those things ever happen, because we, at the end of the day, will not personally sacrifice anything. Time, effort, safety, whatever the case might be. A feeling of safety, any of it. Without a true greater good, personal sacrifice is unconscionable. Without a true greater good, there is nothing for us to care about other than ourselves. Think about it. We don't, as a people, culturally, day to day, at work, at home, at church a lot of times, whatever the case might be, we don't talk about virtue. We don't talk about truth. We don't talk about good and evil or the genuine merits or demerits of ideas, whatever the case might be. We don't talk about anything valuable most of the time. What's the common saying that's been around for decades now? The two things you shouldn't talk about are religion and politics. Well, that's some of the most important things we could talk about, because we're looking at truth and how you're talking about the policy of everyday life, how people are going to be allowed to live. We should be talking about that. We have a responsibility to talk about that. And instead, we've raised multiple generations of people that won't talk about it at all, that can't talk about it hardly. Everything is just whatever feels good. We've rejected truth. See, this is part of what it comes down to, really the key of what it comes down to. We've rejected truth. So any and all difficult conversations are just opinion, right? Religion, politics, governance, truth, virtue, righteousness, things of real value. It all comes down to just opinion, because we've allowed ourselves to reject actual truth, actual standards. And people get aggravated easy when their opinion on something so important, something we understand fundamentally is so important, is rejected because there's no standard to go on. Well, how can you say that my opinion's wrong? Because it's just your opinion too. And all those conversations become totally unproductive because there's no standard. And in fact, they often tear us apart because, again, there is no common ground on what to even talk about. There's no common ground on what's truly right or wrong or anything else. So the conclusion, the solution, is ultimately to look to truth. That's what we have to take away from this. We think about the political parties and the theater that goes on and how nothing seems to change and the status quo and how bad these politicians are and whatever else. And that's right, and we should talk about that. But we have to understand fundamentally that it's on us and that it has to go back to truth. Not looking for what we want in the truth, not looking for the answer that we would like to have, but looking to the truth honestly, just trying to find out what it has to say and conforming to the truth, not trying to conform the world to our own fantasies. The solution is clear. That doesn't mean it's easy. You have to ask yourself the question. I have to ask myself the question, do we have the courage to take that step, to take that solution? It's a simple solution, but it's not easy. Or we can choose to sit back and stay comfortable and distracted by entertainment until we're finally enslaved. That's what it comes down to. You have to answer that question for yourself. I have to answer that question for myself. That's the solution to these problems. That's the problem that we face in politics today. That's the problem we face as a people, as Americans, and we can choose to ignore it a while longer, or we can face up to it, own up to it, and make our decision and make our stand. I hope that this episode has been encouraging, awakening, whatever the case, whatever you need out of it. I hope that you've gained from it. I hope that it's given you something to think about. And I hope that you'll consider supporting me. Tell me what you think down in the comments below. That interaction does help. And remember, friends, as long as you and I are doing what's right, there's a reason I say this every time, as long as you and I are doing what's right, we make a real difference in this old world. It's been Ryan Dalton, the Kentuckian, signing off.